when I was invited to do this talk, I was kind of thinking about like, oh, like I wonder what would be really nice to make. And this is one of my like comfort food recipes. As you'll see, we'll kind of go over it. One of the reasons I like it a lot is because it only has 5 ingredients, and I'm going to go over them right here. Hopefully, you can kind of see them a bit. So the first ingredient for this rice cake, by the way, it's called paletao. That's the name of the dish. It's a Tagalog word, Tagalog being one of the main ethno-linguistic languages spoken in the Philippines. And letao, in the name of the rice cake, means to rise. And one thing I like about not just Filipino food, but like food in general, it's quite funny that the names of foods like are really derived from so many different things. So this one, it's called paletao because it's from the floating action or the letao that these rice cakes make when they're cooked. So let's get started. First ingredient that I want to get you all kind of familiar with today is sticky rice flour. So I have a bag here. You can find this at Chinatown grocery stores, T&T. You can also order it online. I like going to Chinatown for a number of different reasons. I just like being able to like wander around and like pick up some stuff I don't normally buy. But this bag is under $2 at Chinatown, and so one bag is enough for one batch of rice cakes. So yeah, I usually just keep a couple of bags of these at home to get started. And then the next set of ingredients are kind of really about the toppings for this rice cake. So to make the dough, we're gonna make the dough in just a minute. It's just rice cake, sticky rice flour and water. Now the toppings, like to me, that's kind of like the thing that makes the rice cake is the toppings that go on it. So there are 3 toppings that traditionally go on this paletao rice cake. So the first is sesame seeds. So you'll see it here. I have about half a cup of sesame seeds. Now, you can buy them pre-toasted, which is definitely a lot more convenient. And I've talked to like even my sister, she's a little scared of like toasting sesame seeds herself because they do burn. They can burn a little bit easy if you don't like keep an eye on it. With that said, toasting them, I'm gonna show them to you how to toast it today because even just like a couple minutes of toasting like brings out so much of the aroma of the sesame seeds. And because everything else is a pretty kind of basic ingredient, I think it really goes a long way to like making this kind of special, really. And then the 2 other things that are going to go into our toppings are 3/4 cup of sugar, which I also have here, and some shredded coconut. This is the kind of stuff that you'll find at the baking aisle. It's just shredded dried coconut. I would recommend getting the unsweetened kind because we already have sugar and everything. But if you can't find it, any sweetened kind is good. And again, they're kind of like pantry staples, so you can just like keep them. I just keep them in one of my like cabinets here, and it makes it really easy to make and enjoy these rice cakes anytime. So now that we've kind of gone over the main things that we're going to use, we can go ahead and start making them. So I have a couple things set up here. Like I said, this recipe is basically divided into 2 parts. We have the dough and the toppings. So we're going to get the dough started. I have pre-measured 2 cups of the sticky rice flour here. Now another thing I wanted to show you guys here is just the texture of this because it's really interesting. It's not like flour at all. So it's made from glutinous rice, and I mean, I don't know if you can really see it very well, but it's very chalky, which is an interesting texture to work with if you've never used sticky rice before. And when I had one of my first meetings with Jessica, she mentioned that oh, it's like kind of like a magic ingredient because you don't need like eggs or anything else to kind of bind the dough together. And I was like, oh, that's really a good way to think about it. It's like a magic ingredient that you literally just add water, and it's like the original like pancake mix where you just like add one thing, makes it makes it all good. So we're just gonna go ahead and drop that in there.
Hi, sorry, Nastasha, we have a question. Someone asked if they could use non-sticky rice flour for the recipe as well.
Good question. No. Again, because I mean, if you wanted to, like you could, but it's not going to give you the same texture. And I've tried it before. It kind of falls apart really easily when you boil it. So because sticky rice flour is made of glutinous rice, like dried glutinous rice, I think it really does make a difference. So I would recommend trying to get the sticky rice flour if you can.
Okay, great. Thank you. And also, for those who may not know, how does rice cakes relate back to Filipino culture? Is it in the during breakfast? Is it a snack? Is it accompanied by other side dishes? How does it connect back?
So it's more like to me, I always considered it as a snack. It's like again, there's another Tagalog word called merienda, which translates to kind of like snack time. And a lot of these traditional rice cakes are typically consumed as snacks. So like either in the morning or like in the afternoon. They're also consumed a lot for breakfast though. And frankly, when I make, because I make a whole batch of these at a time and I just keep a few of them in the fridge. They're really good for breakfast. I just eat like 2 or 3 and I'm like set for a couple of hours. So yeah, so right now I just want to get this started here. I'm just gonna pour in a cup and a half of water, cold water from the tap is fine. And then, so once it's in the bowl here, you really just mix it. You can use, you know, a spatula, but frankly, I just like mixing everything with my hands. It makes it feel very, I just like being able to touch the food that I'm making. And yeah, earlier you were asking like when like we would typically eat this. Like the way I would typically eat this is, yeah, like I said, for snacks. And I guess I wanted to share like the time, like I distinctly remember learning how to make this in my 4th grade home economics class. So this was back in the Philippines. And I find it interesting because even as late as like the 90s, like home economics classes were still like a part of like the curriculum. I think it's changed now a little bit. But you get to learn a lot of like simple basic like cooking techniques. And I remember learning how to make this then because I was just like so excited that like you could make something like really tasty from like mixing flour with water and like dunking it in a pot. So
Nastasha, question in the chat, is it possible to overmix the flour water mix?
for this case, not, I wouldn't worry about it too much. As you can see here, I'm kind of just like mixing it as like we're talking. And I just want to get it together a little bit more and show you now what it looks like because it's kind of, so I don't know if you can see the dough here. It's kind of like right now it's still quite crumbly. But if you mix it just a little bit more, another like little tip that I guess I can give is that because like I don't, sometimes I have to add a little bit more water. Like in this case, I'll add like just maybe a tablespoon or so because just the quality of the rice flour is a little hard to tell sometimes. So if it feels too chalky, like if it doesn't like feel pliable and smooth, then you can add, I would say like a tablespoon at a time. But just to give you kind of an idea, I want to just mix this a little bit more and show you what kind of the ideal texture that would be like. So got that here. This is about ready. So it's a pretty easy dough to work with. It actually feels like Play-Doh more than anything else. And it kind of looks like the color of like marshmallows. And yeah, like that's all you really need for this one. And once you have this kind of smoothed out, we can just set this aside. Get my bowl back. And yeah, after we have the dough, we're gonna let it rest just for a couple of minutes. And then I would like to kind of move on to like the toppings, because that again is what makes like the kakanin for me, is being able to like really go crazy with like the toppings. So I'm gonna move on here to doing the toasted sesame. Like I said, it's not necessary for you to do this yourself, but to me, like it's one of the exciting things about this is that you are able to, you just like smell it. It's so different when you smell like freshly roasted like seeds. So I'm gonna get this started, and if anyone has any other questions, like feel free.
No other questions yet, but folks, if you have questions, of course, drop them in the chat. But I have a question for you, Nastasha, while you're doing that. Just like kind of curious, what is your favorite Filipino dish, and why? And then contrast to that, what would you say is your least favorite dish if you had one?
That's almost kind of like the whole asking your favorite if you have a favorite child sort of thing. But like food wise, my favorite for sure is sinigang. And sinigang is a dish that, like, it's a sour stew or soup. So I'm just gonna pour the sesame seeds in here. So you just pour it in like a pan. Non-stick pan, has to be non-stick. And we're really just gonna wait for this like a couple of minutes, and it's good that I can kind of talk while we're doing that. But yeah, favorite food would be sinigang. It's a sour soup that is usually, like the main souring agent is traditionally like fruits of different kinds. So you have either tamarind or even leaves from certain trees. You can use like limes. In the Philippines, the most popular kind of citrus is a tiny green fruit called calamansi. Most people wouldn't sour their sinigang with calamansi, but in terms of like adding that hint of sourness, especially now, like since I moved to Canada, like finding like something to cook sinigang with has been an interesting challenge. But also really, I make most of my sinigang with the packets because Filipinos who are like watching this are probably more familiar with that, like you'll see it in grocery stores. Sometimes what I do is I like use half the packet and then I add like a bunch of something. So like I've tried actually sinigang that's soured with rhubarb, and that was really interesting. It really made it. It was a different taste. But yeah, you would have that, and usually the kind of protein that goes with the soup is either pork or seafood. Salmon is also really popular in sinigang. And then so far as least favorites, that'd be a little difficult. I kind of like everything.
Asha, we have another question in the chat for you, which is, what is the most challenging dish that you still love to make?
Most challenging dish.
But you still love to make it.
Oh, but that I still love to make. I would say there's a noodle dish. It's a type of pancit, pancit or kind of the general term for noodle dishes, called palabok. And pancit palabok is like made, like the main flavoring of it comes from seafood, because the area, like in the Philippines, where that's from, originally from rather, is like a seaside like community. So it's like it's a noodle dish that is colored kind of like an orangey tinge, and that color comes from annatto seeds, which are these tiny red little seeds that don't have a whole lot of flavor, but you kind of use them primarily to like tint and color foods. But yeah, like that palabok dish, I love to make occasionally. It was like a full day process because you gotta like make the sauce and then like crush the shrimp heads if you manage to get like full like shrimp, because that like just makes this the sauce of it like fantastic. Like it's a totally different taste without it. Okay, so I just want to come up with a second and kind of just show you, like right now it hasn't really changed color very much, but I wish you could smell it because I can definitely smell the sesame seeds going. It's very light and nutty kind of like.
And Nastasha, question, what are your thoughts on balut? I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, B-A-L-U-T.
Balut, yeah. So balut is, it's a duck embryo. It's an egg. And like my thoughts on it, I guess, are that like I recognize it as a snack that is really popular across the Philippines. Like, it's popular for like if your uncles are like drinking in the garage and they want like drinking food. It's associated with one of those like it makes you stronger kind of things. But for the uninitiated, it can definitely be a bit. It's one of those foods that like has that bit of a fear factor thing to it, because when you open it, you can see what's inside. Taste wise, it's nothing too special. I think it's nothing too special, although I like the soup of it. Hard to get here in Toronto. Okay, so this is almost done here. I'll show you in a second like what the really toasted sesame seeds look like, because you'll see they have changed their color. They're like a lot browner. But one other thing I guess that I wanted to like, or that we were also talking about when we were prepping for this, is that yeah, this kind of like this rice cake, the specific rice cake, it's really just like one of like dozens of varieties of rice cakes. So the Philippines has like a whole lot of them. I have this book here, I don't know if you'll really be able to see very much, but it's called kakanin, and it's all about different foods in the Philippines. And there's a whole section here for kakanin. And I won't be able to go through it right now, but it has all the different ways that like people have molded and like manipulated almost rice to turn it into all these different kinds of treats. One of the most popular types of kakanin, actually, by the way, before I continue doing that, kakanin, again, another Tagalog term, it comes from the word kanin, which refers to rice, like cooked rice. So the term kakanin, again, is a denotion of like all manner of cooked rice delicacies. So it depends. Like sometimes the rice grains are whole, sometimes they're yeah, like in rice flour form like this. And yeah, that takes me to the next part here. Get that off for a second. Is that I have the toasted sesame seeds ready. So as we were talking, that was maybe like 5 minutes or so, and you'll see that the sesame has like turned a very golden color. Again, I don't know if you can see it very much, but it like having that like toasty note to it. Such a big deal. So I'm gonna put that over here to cool. And then in a minute, we're gonna add the coconut and the sugar to it. So while I'm doing that, I'm gonna take my pot of water that's kind of boiling over there, pop that over here because we're ready to start the main part of cooking this rice cake, which is rolling the balls and shaping them or cutting out. So yeah, we're gonna have a big pot of water here. It doesn't even have to be too big, like it's just a medium-sized pot. But the main thing is we have to have a pot of salted boiling water ready. So I'm gonna put this going once again and add a very good couple of pinches of salt to the water. And okay, so now that we got the water kind of just bubbling away here, it's going to be ready for us in a minute. We can turn our attention back to the dough, which is right here. Got that ready. So a typical like paletao size is one that like kind of fits in the palm of your hand. You kind of don't, like I've seen versions that are much larger, but they're kind of hard to eat. So I've found that a tablespoon measure is perfect to get that kind of like enough that it fits in your palm kind of thing. So we've got the dough here. As you can see, I'm just gonna start now. Even just like a few minutes of resting has turned it like quite smooth, which is nice. And I failed to mention the reason I have a big like pan here with parchment paper, and that's for rolling these out. So grab a tablespoon, roll the dough in your hand and just press it slightly until it's a little flat circle. And that is all. And you just go through the batch, make tablespoon size paletao. This like one batch of this makes about like 18 to 20. So it makes a lot, like more than one person can eat in one sitting, which also, one thing I wanted to talk about, makes this a really great recipe for sharing with people. So like for me personally, like I've always found food is like the thing that obviously like roots me and connects me to home, which is the Philippines for me. But especially in the time that I've lived in Toronto, I've lived with so many different roommates. And like one of my favorite things is just like cooking. Well, I like to cook, so like I do cook for them. But one of my favorite things is when I cook something for them and like they actually really like it a lot. So because my roommates and I have been stuck at home through the whole quarantine, I've been cooking quite a bit, and this is one of the things I cook. And yeah, my Italian roommate was like pleasantly surprised because he's not too fond of like sticky textures very much, and this is a sticky rice cake, so it's quite chewy. But he really liked the topping part of it, so that was cool.
Nice. Thanks for sharing that, Nastasha. Wondering if you wanted to actually share more about your work and the work that you do in your podcast that you have. And then after that, there's another question in the chat that I'll turn to after.
Yeah, totally. So I podcast, by January, it'll be 4 years now that I'm making it, which sounds like a lot. And in podcast time, it sounds like a lot. But I also haven't necessarily been very consistent with it. I started it because at the time, while there were there was a growing number of people online on social media and stuff talking about Filipino food. There wasn't a whole lot about like the history of it, like the region, like about regional cuisine, because the Philippines is made up of like over 7,000 islands and 84 provinces. Like there's so much in terms of like regional variation. And I couldn't really find very much about it. I mean, it wasn't accessible to me. That's what the thing was. It's not that it didn't exist. It's just it wasn't accessible online. And really, everybody looks up stuff online now. So that was the main reason I started my podcast. I wanted to be able to share with people stuff that I learned. I have a pretty big cookbook collection. I can show you guys a little bit later. It's actually just over there. And so as I'm reading these different books, like I'm learning about, like the history of certain places. And then I think just over time too, as I talked to the authors of these books that I had come to love, and like sometimes I would on the podcast, sometimes I interview, I definitely have a few like celebrity chef kind of like interviews on there too. People who are kind of like reworking Philippine cuisine. That's to have a more modern like take, a non-traditional take. So it's just been really interesting to kind of see how over the last couple of years, like the conversation around Filipino cuisine has really been has expanded more, and not just like about like why it's not very mainstream, and more into like what can we do to kind of like empower the community, and not just people who identify as Filipino, Filipina, Filipinx, but just everyone. Like the storytelling, there's so much interesting stuff that happens with like regard to food. So I could talk about this forever, so I'm gonna stop now.
No, that's amazing. I'm so happy that you're moving on to 4 years of it already, and that you're bringing awareness to the cuisine. That's great. Question, a couple of questions actually in the chat. What the tradition is behind boodle fights?
Boodle fight, yeah, good question. So boodle fight is one of those things that like, when I started seeing it on Instagram, it just I was like, this is going to be like really popular. People like, it's great because like, it's like at the core, really what I think is great about eating is that you eat it with somebody. You're there to share it. The history of boodle fights is that it's just kind of contentious because it's not a traditional Filipino way of eating per se. The boodle fight specifically was started in kind of a military like space. It's kind of like army mess hall sort of thing where like everybody would gather at a central table and have everything sort of laid out. And then people can kind of help themselves to sampling the different foods, which will always include rice. We'll always have various kinds of protein, grilled chicken, meat, fish, vegetables. But if I can share, like one of the interesting perspectives on boodle fight that I had with a few people online before is that in the Philippines traditionally, like that's not something, boodle fights aren't something that you would just like have on a regular basis, because the idea of having all that kind of food, like it's a celebratory thing. So like you also kind of don't want, it's kind of like against the mindset of a lot of people to like have so much food out there, rice especially, that like once it's out there, like you can't really like like keep it and set it aside. So a lot of it ends up becoming wasted. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of like a roundabout answer to that, but it started as an army, like military thing, became really popular. Even in the Philippines, like restaurants there were just like, they had Budo fight specials and people like pay money to do it. I've got the water boiling back here now, so I'm going to move back on to our palitaw making because the water is at a ready boil. I've got enough pieces in here. I didn't complete the whole tray because it'll take a while, but as you can see here, I've got a few that are ready to go. And let's get started. So I've got a pot of boiling water here, and we are going to just drop them in one at a time. And I would say for a pot this size that maybe holds about like 6 cups of water, I wouldn't put in more than like 4. Let's make it 5.
Can folks steam it instead of boiling it?
No, I would no. It's because it's the water, it's just the water and the salt that's literally cooking it. It would have to be boiled. And the idea here is that you just like leave it. You're not going to touch it. And it's nice that we're doing this real time, which is one of the reasons I was so excited to do this today. Is because they literally take between like 2 to 3 minutes to like rise. So I'm just gonna leave that here for a minute while that cooks. Go back to the toppings because we still have that. So I've got the sesame here, nice and toasty. We have sugar, pop that in there. Coconut, also pop that in there. And give that a stir. And also the nice thing about this coconut mixture is, I mean, you're not going to finish it all for all of this, but that just means that you get to have like coconut sesame sugar topping, whatever the hell you want. I've put it on toast, like put a little bit of butter, put a little bit of this topping on top. Good snack. Okay, so we've got that mixed in perfect time because now we have the palitaw rising. So it's hard. I can't like bring the camera over here so you can't see them actually rising, but I'm going to fish them out here. So now they are ready. Actually, let's just move this here for a minute because I do want to get them on there. And this is just my thing. I have a little like cookie wrap, and it helps to just dry out the palitaw a little bit. So once they float, let me see if I can put this over here because it really makes a difference for you to see how it floats. So as you can see here right now, like that's what they look like when they float. They literally just float to the surface. So it's kind of like nice to have there for sure. Oh. All right. So let's go ahead and take these out, and we're just going to pop them on the cookie tray. Then I'm going to add the next batch in. Going back to the question about Budo fight earlier, I think what's more like the thing to kind of like take away from like the popularity of Budo fights is that what it highlights is the kamayan aspect of it. And I think that's kind of the interesting, that's kind of like one of the important things to like think about is that kamayan itself, which is again kind of, it has a story to the word. So kamayan is a style of eating with your hands. In the word kamayan, kamay means your hands. So if you say you're eating kamayan style, that literally just means you're eating with your hands. And so in Budo fights, that's how people eat typically, is you eat with your hands. So I think what was interesting when it started becoming a thing in North America is that it allowed, I don't know if allowed is the right word, but like it encouraged a lot more people, perhaps a lot more people of Filipino descent to be comfortable with that, because it was kind of like a little bit of a cool thing to like be able to kind of like introduce your friends who are not Filipino to it. And it's just fun because like I've been doing this entire time, like I use my hands for everything, most things. So yeah, I got the next batch of paleta already here, so I'm just gonna fish these out, and then we're gonna go and dip them into the topping.
Cool. Nastasha, quick question while you're doing that. What's a Filipino food that is a must try, asking as a non-Filipino with no exposure? That's coming from Saida in the chat.
Thanks for the question. I always say that if you have not had Filipino food before, the best place to start is with adobo. And you're gonna, if you speak to any Filipino person, they will be familiar with adobo. Adobo is essentially a stew, soured with vinegar this time. So earlier I was talking about sinigang, that's soured with fruits. Adobo, which is really more a cooking process than it is a particular recipe. Anyway, so that dish is always soured with vinegar. So I would say, please go ahead and try adobo. Again, all of the Filipino restaurants within Toronto, even outside of Toronto, for sure will have their version of adobo. Typically, it's made with either pork or chicken. Those are the two kind of really popular choices in terms of protein. And it's flavored with peppercorns, garlic, bay leaf. Now, when you say adobo, most people are familiar with the kind that includes soy sauce. However, one of the interesting things that I really had found out after I started doing all this research is that the original adobo was kind of a white adobo. Like they did not have the soy sauce, because soy sauce is a Chinese influence, and that really only came to the shores of the Philippines when trading and Chinese merchants like had made their way to the islands and started trading with people. So try it all. All right, we're ready to coat now. So I have these ones here. They're pretty. They're cooler to the touch. You'll see they're a little bit. You can see they're a little bit on the sticky side. So let's just go ahead and drop that in there. Let's just go ahead and use this. It gets a little bit sticky once you put the toppings on. So got a little serving board here, so I'm just gonna plop that on there. And yeah, this is also really fun to do if you have kids around or people who just want to play with food. This is a really great recipe because I've made this with like nieces and nephews, and it's great. They just like pick up a rice cake, they dip it in like this sugary coating mixture, and yeah, you can eat them straight away. This thing too is like really only best, like you don't want to like leave it in the fridge and then eat it in like 5 days kind of thing, because the texture of the rice cake really changes after a couple of days. But if it's just overnight, you can leave it in there. And actually, I remember that Jessica, I think, was also asking if there's like a little tip or something that I can share. And there is, which I didn't realize was a tip until I told my roommate about it. And they're like, yeah, totally. People wouldn't think of like doing that. You can freeze these. And what I mean is like freeze like this, like the shaped and flattened rice flour doughs. So I was going to show you here. Got a batch of So after you shape them all and like lay them out on the pan with the parchment, I just cover that with some like cling wrap and stick it in the freezer for like a couple of hours. And then when you're ready, you can just like take it out, and it just becomes this like frozen. This one's a little oddly shaped, but it becomes like a frozen like disc of like rice flour, and it just takes like probably an extra minute to cook when you cook them. But this is a great, like if you're cooking, because I've made this a lot of times, like just with myself at home, and I'm like, there's no way I'm gonna cook like the whole batch. So that's where I learned how to like freeze a whole batch of them. And like I said, the topping like keeps a while, so you can like just like keep the topping like ready there. I'll take my scarf off. You can keep the topping ready, and then cook that for a few minutes, and then you have like breakfast if you have people coming over. One thing I'll say too is like now that we have kind of the holidays coming up, I'm trying to find some stuff with my family, given how everything is this year. If you can't, like if you are gathering with people, even if it's not your immediate family, if you're just like gathering with people that you want to spend like time with, it's a fun recipe to do. You can get people involved and stuff. And yeah. So,
Nastasha, we have a couple more questions, so I want to definitely make sure we get to them. One of them is, how would you describe the characteristics of Filipino food, or in other words, what makes Filipino food Filipino food? Great question. And then there's another question around where you bought the Kain Na cookbook.
where about the what?
Kain Na?
Oh, the cookbook, right? Okay, I can answer that.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. So actually, let me answer the kind of, because that's really quick. I go to this website called the Kitchen Bookstore, and they ship to Canada. So this is from their website. So it's thekitchenbookstore.com. And you can order from there. They are a bookseller based in the Philippines, so they have some really interesting stuff on there. I already have all the books that are there. But that was the one I got from there. The other question about, what was it again? Like more about like Filipino food in general?
Yeah, what makes Filipino food Filipino food? So what are the kind of characteristics or descriptions or ingredients maybe that really makes a dish a Filipino dish?
I would have, I guess, like two answers to that. Like, if I was in the Philippines, for people in the Philippines like even today, freshness is really it. Like if you look at even those like base like Filipino dishes that you will see in restaurants and takeout menus here, like adobo, like sinigang, those, like the origins of those dishes are really rooted in the ingredients that are available. So if I asked myself this question, I was living in the Philippines with access to fresh fruits, like a really great quality vinegar, like, I don't know, native chickens, like I would say like that's really what makes a Filipino dish Filipino would be the quality of the food. And that's not just like a Filipino thing, that's like everything. Like what makes the best like East Coast lobster rolls would have to be the quality of your lobster. Now, as a member of the diaspora community here in Toronto, I would have to say it's like, it sounds really cheesy, but like I would say like community and like getting together with people to eat it. Because like what I found interesting is like, because I like to cook a lot here, it's not the same if you're eating it by yourself. Like I'll make some and then I'll have some and like, my roommates get home or whatever. But it's kind of like that spirit of being able to like sit and share with people and like eat it. With that said, the sourness in terms of like flavor profiles, I guess, is like one of the really big things. So like a lot of Filipino food is not quite sour, but like there's a definite note of sourness. And again, that kind of comes from just like many, many, many years of like having to find a natural way to preserve your foods, because it's a tropical country and temperatures are like 40 degrees on a regular basis.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, so before we run out of time, I wanted to show you guys the finished paletao. So I kind of just laid them out here on the little cheese board, and I'll move the camera up here in a little bit. But they're not like visually striking like ube, for example. And ube is the purple yam that is really popular in desserts and stuff. But I want to pick one up and bite into it. So you'll see it's quite jiggly. And it's a textural thing. Because it is made with sticky rice flour, it's quite chewy, which I like. Not everyone is used to eating like a sticky rice cake like this, but it's just so comforting. Like, to me, like when I need to like, I've made this when I like need to de-stress. And like, actually one of the things I really like about this is that we're talking about personal wellness and being able to see food as something that can like play a part in your own kind of journey of like personal wellness. And this in particular is I kind of just think of like setting aside an hour to do this, like roll the whole batch of like dough and like toast the sesame seeds and like cook the actual thing. That's kind of like my de-stressing thing. If I've had like a really, really long day, or like I want to dance in the kitchen or something, like sometimes I'll just put on some music and like, I don't know, put Spotify best R&B of 2010s kind of thing and just like do whatever, dance in the kitchen while I'm making it. But that's a nice way to kind of like focus and like be present with like doing something, even if it's just rolling balls of dough and dropping them into like a pot, if that makes sense.
Totally. I totally agree with putting on music and just cooking. Like that is a whole vibe. That's the vibe. We have a question. So Sabrina said she's been going through your podcast and you've had so many cool guests on your show. Amy Bessa, Felice Marie. Who are your dream guests you'd want on your show?
Oh, I have a lot. Actually, one of my dream guests is not one of my dream guests is a historian. He's really famous. He's famous in the Philippines because he writes a really popular column, a newspaper column, also online. His name is Annabeth Ocampo, and he's actually come to Toronto a couple of times. But he teaches history at one of the big universities, and I read a series of his books called Looking Back, and there's so much about food in there, and just like understanding like how the prices of ingredients, like actually that's a thing too, like with this recipe we're using very staple ingredients like rice, sugar, coconut. In terms of like the role of these ingredients in Philippine cuisine, it's very big. Like they're crops, they're agricultural products that the Philippines still today like relies on heavily. But I'm not going to get into it right now. There's one thing I will say is that there is, when you start getting interested in it and you look up online, you will see that there is still a lot of like ongoing conflict between like farmers and the people they work for, particularly around rice and sugar and coconuts. Because despite the fact that the country is like rich with those natural resources, that doesn't trickle down. That rarely trickles down to like the farmer level, the people who make them. So yeah, I'd say like with the podcast too, like it's definitely broadened my perspective in terms of like what can I do like in over here in like Toronto. And I do think that having that platform to at least you know, to save my own personal curiosity, but also hopefully like try to encourage other people to be a little bit more critical with thinking about, okay, so like yes, we know rice and coconut are like really big in Philippine cooking, but like what happens when like right now, like a lot of the rice in the Philippines has to be imported from Vietnam because the farmers are just unable to produce like the amount of demand that there is locally. So food can be political, and it is political. I think it is up to us who are interested to like educate ourselves about it, and then from there, like see how you can best make an impact. And then it does affect you, like how we perceive our community here in Canada.
Mhm.